Matter. Go to the next slide. Richard Taylor responds, it really matters a lot. Whether one walks now in the light, when you're shown it, and presses his way into a victorious experience or limps along for years, is not a matter of indifference. To treat it as such is to encourage believers to follow the path of least resistance. I told you nobody wants to die to themselves. And select, by default, the more gradual process. And where are the witnesses? Who's been sanctified by a process? He says, and where are the witnesses to a clear experience of entire sanctification attained by gradual process? Go ahead. Then these are just other smaller ones also that followed in the same line of thought. What they started doing was, well, if we can't stress process enough, and that's not enough to do that, well, then what we'll do is we'll shift and we'll just talk about regeneration. When you get saved, that's the big deal. And they started making too much out of being saved. And so, friends, pretty soon sanctification kind of just went, okay? Another smaller guy, what he did was he said, it's just discipline. Just discipline yourself, you'll get there. And that doesn't work. Go ahead. Now, this is the big bang. This is when things start going real wrong. Is when they said, well, God doesn't thoroughly deal with the sin nature when you get sanctified. Instead, when you get sanctified, some of these guys said, and John Miley was the leader of them, and he's the next big theologian in Methodism. What he did was he said, no, I don't really want to stress original sin as that corruption. And so in doing that, he ended up denying original sin. Friends, if you do that, you're no better than Pelagius was. You're no better than the person in the history of the church way back, before the church in Nazarene ever existed, that said, hey guys, we're just born good. Well, friends, go look at a baby. Talk to them for a few minutes and ask them, I want you to go over there and sit down right now. Do they do it? Do they listen to you? Will they listen to you? I mean, you'll watch it over and over and over again. They will always say, no way. That's the first word they often know. No, I'm going to have my way. And so, friends, you're no better than that. That's what he did. The second thing that he did was he said, it's not dealt with when we get sanctified. Instead, it's just kind of rendered inoperative. We'll just kind of weaken our stand on it. And then we'll go on describing all the problems that sanctified people still have. And so, friends, by the time that he got done, literally, Wesley was over here and Miley was way over here. All right? Go ahead. Okay. Now, what he also did was he brought up arguments against eradication. Now, one of the biggest arguments that's ever been argued against eradication is if you lose the nature to sin when you get sanctified, if it's destroyed, that's what eradication means. If it's destroyed in the way you want to say it is, well then, how does a person fall back into sin? Well, friends, Adam and Eve didn't have a nature to sin, and they sinned. Okay? All you need is a free will. And I'm going to explain that to you later, but I want you to understand that Noel Wesleyan, that's what Taylor writes against him. He says, I can't believe my eyes. I can't believe that somebody who's in Wesleyan circles would ever argue that. We've had people saying that on the outside all along, but I can't believe somebody on the inside, especially as big as he was, would ever accept that kind of thought. Go ahead. Now, we can date this shift. From 1840 to 1890, Watson to Miley, there was a big transition in early Methodism. Now, there's two things that caused that. One was the change in idea about slavery. That split the Methodist Episcopal Church, North and South. Just like the Civil War, right at the Civil War, they split because they no longer stood against slavery. And so that was one of the backslidings that they committed. Go ahead. The second one was the main one. They let their focus go off of holiness. They stopped saying, guys, you need to be sanctified. That's what we're all about. It's the grand depositum, in the words of their father. No, now it's just a side issue, okay? An option. Now listen to this. Metz, our writer again, he summarizes this and he points to something that we haven't talked about yet. Go ahead. Go to the next slide. What he said was basically in America at this time, process thought. Not the kind of process thought you're thinking of from the Church of Nazarene today. But I'm talking about process thought, which is not even Christian in its origin. Okay? Liberal scholars, so-called, who don't even believe Jesus is Lord, often thought he was misrepresenting God, often thought that the Bible is not inspired, it's not inerrant, it's not the truth, it contains the Word of God. All those kind of bozos is where all of a sudden this huge sway across American culture and American thought pattern came. All of a sudden everybody started thinking that all this big stuff about Jesus that Christianity had traditionally passed on was, we need to question it. And friends, it hit America. It hit America right at the time that the American Holiness movement started. That's what I'm trying to point out to you. So go ahead, keep going. Now, by the time of the 20th century, Wesley's theology was not only modified, it was practically rejected. As one writer noted, the references to John Wesley in Methodist theological literature were infrequent. When they did appear, more often than not, their purpose was to correct rather than to find corroboration in Wesley. They rejected John Wesley. They didn't even want to hear what he had to say about things anymore. In the early decades of the 20th century, historic Wesleyan theology was first modified and then rejected by theological liberalism. In general character and spirit, this theology had much more concern with the theology current in other denominations than it did with its own heritage. The combination of an aggressive liberalism and a zealous ecumenical thrust removed Methodism to a barren theology and Wesley to a historic relic. Even our liberal today, there's a guy named Albert Outler who's a liberal thinker about Wesley. Even he admits that this transition happened right at that time. So go ahead. Okay, and this led gradually to the most crucial change of all, as far as the Wesleyan tradition is concerned, the displacement of the older optimism of grace, the expectation of being made perfect in love in this life, with a new optimism based on a moral and spiritual progress. And so basically he's admitting, even this liberal is, that from that huge transition in American culture, all of a sudden everybody was thinking that gradualism is the thing. And that's how we're going to get sanctified, by growing into it, not God transforming our lives. Go ahead. Okay, so all I'm trying to say to you guys is that there's a lot of people who will write a history of Methodism, but what they'll do, or the Church of the Nazarene, but they won't focus at this point in our history on what was going on in American culture. Okay? Instead of focusing on what's going on in American culture, they'll just try to define the church in and of itself. And so they're missing what was really going on was this huge gradual stress in the culture of America at the time. Keep going. What it did was it dumbed down the Bible. First of all, it started saying, well, you know, if there's evolution, that's the first form of process theology. If there's evolution, then Adam wasn't the first man. There's men before him. There's monkeys before him. And then we've got to dumb down the whole Bible. And friends, ultimately, if you dumb down the whole Bible so that God can't do anything until the New Testament, He can't do anything until this point, He can't do anything until this point, then because man's not there yet, if you get to that point, then what you're going to do ultimately is you're going to really lower the standard of the New Testament. You're going to take out the concepts of holiness that we believe in, and you're going to pull holiness out of the Bible, and that's exactly what ended up happening. But friends, this has all been proven wrong since then. The whole culture of America says, wow, what a thought, evolution. They all sucked it and grabbed it, and friends, what it ended up doing was they just didn't even look at archaeology, they didn't look at the science, and they found out since then all of this has been broken down. It all failed. Go ahead. Keep going. Now, these are just all people admitting that Darwin stuff came up in Methodism. Methodism sucked it up. The moment that they heard it, they started saying, hey, that sounds pretty good. And so instead of criticizing it anymore, now it's the number one thing. Go ahead, let's go with it. Now, here's another main point. In 1875 and 1925, there's what we call the Eradication Wars. Again, instead of understanding that God does a thorough transformation in a moment, a destruction of the sin nature. Instead of doing that, what they started doing was saying in the Methodist Church, no, it's got to be weaker than that. I don't understand that term. Let's just kind of break it down and make it something else. So they made it repression, suppression. Now I want you to look at all the names on there. There's some big names. Bishop Randolph Foster, John Miley, the major theologian of that period, Beat, Dr. Whedon, all these different ones, they all believed that Wesley was wrong on that issue, that eradication of the sinful nature was not the correct position. So what I'm trying to show you in this first section is I'm trying to show you that the leading position in the Methodist Church at the time of the American Holiness movement was that the sin nature is only in some sense cleansed, but it still remains at entire sanctification. So you're going to have to deal with sin in some sense the rest of your life. Now, friends, when they all boil it down and you keep arguing with these people, they will break it down and break it down and break it down, and eventually they'll end up sounding like you're saying the same thing. But the point is that when you're trying to get a quick concept of holiness, every time I've run into somebody who believes in anything less than the absolute destruction of sin nature, they always end up tying onto it that we have some further sin problem in our lives. I had one man in our generation, he was standing in front of me and he said, Ben, he said, after I got sanctified, I really had to deal with self. He said, you know, self is another word for the sin nature. He says, I really had to deal with it. He said, layer by layer, I started figuring out more and more how, this is a Wesleyan man, he's teaching. Okay? And he's saying, layer by layer, I just kept having to deal with the problem. And friends, by the time he was done with his talk, he was saying, I purposely put a barb in something I say to hurt my wife. I purposely do this. I purposely do that. See, friends, he's lowered the standard. I mean, you're not even supposed to be living in willful sin by the time you're saved. That's Wesley. Now all of a sudden, we're at sanctification. We're even above sanctification, friends. And you can't live above sin. Okay, we've gone somewhere. Keep going. Okay, so right at the beginning of this time, right when the Church of the Nazarenes' forefathers and foremothers came out, they were responding to that shift in Methodism. How many more minutes do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. Phoebe Palmer, and we're going to talk about her later too, but she immediately came under attack in our day. Matter of fact, this whole movement called the American Holiness movement, friends, if Methodism is our grandparent, the American Holiness movement is our parents, okay? That's where we came from, all right? Now, what they did, instead of understanding holiness the way the Methodism did, with their gradual grow into it concepts, what they did was they said, no, God transforms you in a moment. It's an instantaneous transformation, and they stress that he has to destroy the sin nature, okay? And that was their point. And so this movement spread. Keep going. Phoebe Palmer was one of the main influences. Like I said, she came under attack. I'm going to show you some of the things they say against her now, and I'm going to argue against them tonight. But the point is that she had a very easy method to help you get sanctified. She called it her altar theology. And what she did, just like Wesley, she said, guys, stop thinking you're going to grow into it. That's what she said. She said, what you need to do is consecrate yourself in a certain sense. And when you're done consecrating yourself, you just need to believe, and God's going to do it for you. That's as simple as that. It's a short way to holiness. That's how she explained it. But friends, when they got done hearing that, all these people who were sitting there going, God, I can't do it. I'm just going to keep striving. I'm going to keep trying. All of a sudden, they were all experiencing sanctification. Look at this. It says some people say more superintendents were sanctified in their Tuesday meetings in her home than at camp meetings. I can tell you even better than that. She won 25,000 people to Christ. And she went worldwide. God used her in an amazing way. God spread this movement. It wasn't just Nazarene. We weren't there yet, okay? It was spread all over the culture of America. Go ahead. He's the other, one of the more important figures at the beginning, Timothy Merritt. He also stressed it just like Wesley did. He came out from the Methodism and all the concepts there. Now, here's an outline coming to Church of the Nazarene. We're going to go into that in my second section. But the Holiness Revival swept the nation starting in 1835. The main thrust was from 1858 to 1888. Within Methodism, it started. That's where it first began. Really, it went all the way back to 1835 with Phoebe Palmer. It went 1865 to 85. Right? Independent holiness sect formation took place next from 1894 to 1907. There were two groups. We already heard Peter mention the first one were the come-outers. They were the people in Methodism responding to it in a radical way, going, you guys are not teaching what we believe anymore. And so pretty soon, even though they tried to stick loyal to the church, because it was in Methodism at first, pretty soon Methodism crunched down on them. We're going to see that in a moment here. But then the loyalists were inside going, hold on, we want to believe it too. I understand there's this movement of everybody getting sanctified now, and I'm inside the church, and I believe that it's still, like you say it is, outside the church. It's Christ's holiness. I still believe in that. So look, I'm in the church. And they tried to defend it from inside Methodism. An attack came after that on entire sanctification in Methodism because some people started to see it as dividing the Methodist church, come-outers and loyalists. And so they started to react to it for that reason, but mainly because, friends, again, entire sanctification is against our nature. And we are holiness opposers if we don't watch out. And then holiness social work leads to separate bodies. And then finally there was the Church of the Nazarene, 1895, 1908. Now, here is a book that's written from a medium position at that time. It's called Purity and Maturity. I picked up that book thinking it was an old book on process. I got in there and the guy spent 2/3 on crisis. And friends, he's a loyalist. He's in the church. J.A. Wood was a loyalist inside the church going, hey, I still believe holiness the way we should believe it. And he's saying, look it though, there are guys in my church, even he's admitting, there are guys in my church that don't believe it like we should believe it. And there are guys that, I love my ministers, but they're not doing it right. Even on that side, he's still saying, guys, we're not stressing it enough. I'm trying to prove to you that if you've heard the concept I heard from the start about the American Holiness movement, is that was a bunch of crack-headed guys and women. They kind of just overstressed something. They got off on the wrong boat. And I've heard them called prideful. I've read them be called prideful, everything else. They just insulted that whole movement. Matter of fact, I just got finished taking a course insulting the whole movement. But I want you to know that at that time, they weren't just coming out going, crisis, crisis, crisis. There's no process. There's no process, like you've probably heard. What they were doing was they were coming out going, guys, they're all saying it's all gradual. It's all process. It's all process. And they said, no, there is a crisis. That's what they're trying to say. And there's growth after. And there's growth before. Nobody ever denied that. And so we need to understand that in the whole period of history there's been a miscalculation on our part in our day to sit there and judge them because they were perceiving that there is somebody in their church, which is big time happening. We can go ahead and skip a few more slides. I want to show you some of these. Here's all the acts. Go ahead, stop there. It says the MEC North, this is the church, the Methodist Church, North in 1888 and 94, ordered their limitations to be placed upon all loyalist efforts to stress holiness. So they're not only reacting to the outsiders who've already left the church, they're responding to the ones in it and going, okay? And they put a death grip hold on them, so they can't do what they're supposed to do. Keep going. So the doctrine just came under attack. Keep going. Okay, just a second. Let me kind of double check if there's anything I've left out here. There's a slide. Keep going. It's called Purity and Maturity at the end. No, I think that's it. Keep going. It starts with, yeah, there it is. Okay. In his book, Purity and Maturity, after defending the sanctification experiences of many of his clergy friends from a recent attack, this is J. Wood, one of our first people in our church that we stressed. He sadly admits that the clergy members could have given sanctification more emphasis. There's his own preachers. He's criticizing them. Or its rightful place in their teaching. Even the mellowed-out loyalists admit this overstress on gradualism. You see, friends, they had to play it cool to stay in the Methodist Church at that time. They couldn't come out like the come-outers and say, hey, guys, it's a crisis, and just, you got to believe it. They weren't free like that. Every time they did that, they tied themselves in with those other people. And so here he is inside his church, keeping cool with them, and even then, he's still admitting that there's an overstress, right? The origin of the stress of process and holiness was not a recent invention. We didn't get smarter since the holiness movement. That's what I'm trying to point out to you also. Okay, it's not some recent invention that we've corrected since then. Therefore, the holiness movement cannot be faulted for their stress on what in their perception was a recent absence of the instantaneous work of entire sanctification. Now, one last thing. This is William Burt Pope. If you read him, he wasn't in America at the time, his teaching. He was a Methodist, but he was over in in England. And his teaching was largely in England. And what I'm saying is he kept faithful. But he's a little bit after the American Holiness movement. It brought Methodism a little bit back, like we just heard. Okay, so that's pretty much it. If there's any questions, anything